Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Holmes and Watson. So, I'm going to probably approach this movie a lot differently than I probably would a lot of other movies that ultimately I could easily say it's like, oh, well, this movie's stupid and what a waste of time. Where's my money back? Blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to approach this differently. I honestly enjoyed how stupid this movie was. Um, because I knew it was going to be stupid. Like, I think that's blatantly obvious that this movie is going to be a silly thing that people did once. And I think that's what people need to understand about this film is really it's not a movie that takes itself at all seriously. We have it to where it seems that in this movie there are certain patterns that I guess Sherlock Holmes has to fall on in I guess every single Sherlock Holmes movie, but I think reasonably within this film they were also kind of parodying off of this of the Robert Downey Jr. movies. When looking at it, like this feels like to me, this feels like a parody variation off of off of a certain kind of genre, because I don't think this exactly goes into like Sherlock Holmes exactly. I think it also kind of goes into kind of making fun of like the whodunit genre in general, to where ultimately the approach of it all is just like you have it to where yeah, Will Ferrell is like Sherlock Holmes, but at a absurd degree, and to ultimately you have Watson, who is of course Watson, but again absurd degree. Every single character that is on here, but of course, really they get to an absurd degree for everyone. So, because of course it's just a joke film. So nothing is really at all like straight laced or nothing at all like there's like a point where there seems to even be like a Patrick Swayze ghost moment shared by John C. Reilly and Rebecca Hall, which ultimately is Dr. Watson and Grace Hart, where ultimately they get this like weird, bizarrish Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore pottery making moment between the two of them, which makes no sense in this movie, but they're just having this bizarrish moment. We also get it to where ultimately we have like a lot of absurdities, a lot of stuff where ultimately we have like a drunken escapades with evidently Holmes and Watson at some point. Uh, we also get it to where seemingly Sherlock Holmes is really infatuated with a girl in this movie, which ultimately I will get to. Bizarrely, also, there is a musical number in this movie, which I didn't understand why that it was there. But it also seemed, of course, forcibly, that one person definitely is not like singing their part, which I thought was hilarious, and so on and so forth. Uh, I really just enjoyed how dumb this movie was. I think there's some times when there's certain things that take itself way too seriously, and I think usually Sherlock Holmes is kind of one of those where it takes itself like way too like you have a guy that freaking knows everything about everything, and this guy is just like the uh like if anything, like don't even try to go to any detective, just go straight to Sherlock Holmes for everything, even if it's a simple or simplistic case. uh but yeah, but I just thought that this movie was funny. I just thought it was fun. I think reasonably, like preparing myself for knowing that this movie could honestly have been just a throwaway film, ultimately just kind of made me even want to go into it more, just because I was like, nah, like I'll just have fun for a couple hours. Really, we kind of get into some kind of old fashioned tropes within this movie as well. Uh, but we also like it. Kind of really does for me, honestly, kind of remind me of the Robert Downey Jr. movies, but in a parody like fashion. Um, we also have Moriarty in this movie as a villain, and uh, really when looking at it, I'm like, well, of course you have to go that route because reasonably, like, there is no other famous Sherlock Holmes villain, and so reasonably you're kind of pushed into doing that. Um, but yeah, so like it becomes a who done it, and eventually it seems like there is an actual reasonable answer out of all of this thing. But it is kind of funny where Sherlock eventually like continues to go around and around and like just immediately eventually gets to a point of accusing people. And I think it gets rather interesting within the story. We also have the Queen within this movie, which ultimately they have an absurd scene at some point with the Queen, um, and so on and so forth. But anyways, so I think that's all I could say about this movie because really, when talking about it anymore, like there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of jumbling going on in this movie. There's a whole lot of like stuff to be uh, like taken out of this or taken into watching this movie as well as any other Sherlock Holmes movie would be. It's kind of all over the place. So when watching this, ultimately, I'm not going to probably remember every single detail or every single little thing because there's a whole lot of crap to just digest when watching this movie. But also, there's a lot of goofy things that ultimately you get distracted by because ultimately there's a lot of goofy things that ultimately get approached within this film, and ultimately you're like heavily distracted by some goofy thing that they do, and like you don't exactly remember what goes on into any number of any scenes because you're just distracted by by somebody just doing some silly and or goofy thing. So yeah, I think that's all I could say about this in a non-spoiler sense because ultimately, once we get in further, I'm just eventually gonna have to just talk about this and just deep dive into it, because reasonably there's some stuff that doesn't make any rational sense when I watched this movie. I was like, what the heck is going on in this film? I don't quite understand it, but I'm just going along with it. So let's go on to spoiling this movie. If ultimately you've heard of Sherlock Holmes and you know how in depthly that he has to go prattling on about how much he knows about everything before everything actually happens and so on and so forth. Let's go into spoilers. I guess one last thing that I could say is Will Ferrell's character has an absurdly good sense of smell, which ultimately comes off to be like the greatest sniffer of all time, I guess. Nozzle of all time, nose of all time. So I think that it's kind of like it kind of helps the story, or it kind of makes for a goofy thing of of basically Sherlock Holmes's character being able to like know a person's coming before they are coming, or know something is happening before something is happening, just because of Sherlock Holmes's nose. I would assess. So let's go into spoiler time. It's also mean dust out that double five to otherwise say this is a overall stupid movie, but at the end of the day, it was really a fun one as well. Where can ultimately you find this? Well, ultimately I went on to Hulu, but ultimately Hulu told me that that ultimately uh, Holmes and Watson is on Stars. So you can do one of two things. You can go on Amazon and probably uh, have a free subscription to Stars if you've never been on Stars before, or you can reasonably just go on to a movie app of some kind that ultimately does stuff for absolutely free with probably ads. And you can watch any number of films for absolutely free. I would suggest probably going into a movie pro or a movie play box or a movie box or some sorts, and ultimately you can probably watch this movie free with ads. So go ahead and do that if that's what you want to do. Ultimately, let's go into this movie. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we have it to where in the beginning of this film, we have to have Watson and Holmes meet. And we ultimately have it to where it seems that Watson is on the rooftop of some place, and ultimately Watson falls off the rooftop to smash into Sherlock Holmes's giant watermelon-like fruit of sorts. And ultimately, we have it to where Watson ultimately falls onto this fruit that ultimately Sherlock had been growing for quite some time, and Watson is crushing every piece of this fruit, and ultimately Sherlock is ultimately telling him, "Oh, please don't step more on the fruit," and he's crushing the whole thing. And so, moving on, we ultimately have to kind of showcase how they just bizarrely met one another, and so pushing on to where ultimately there is ultimately a questionable case that ultimately Moriarty is going to court for, and we ultimately push on to have Will Ferrell Sherlock ultimately being late for said appointment. Being late for said appointment because ultimately he is practicing the pre-aha moment before it actually happens. And so we ultimately have him eventually go into the court, and we have Watson, who is just bizarrely like taking out his guns and firing everywhere. He's firing at the clock, I guess, to stop it. He's firing at the judge, like he's firing at everybody bizarrely with his guns. I'm like, isn't Watson a doctor? I'm like, why is he shooting everything? But I guess it's just a weird and or wild thing to do. So we have it to where ultimately we have Sherlock Holmes, who is ultimately looking at Moriarty in this courtroom, and ultimately he is saying, it's like, well, hey, this is not Moriarty. This is his cousin, so and so Moriarty, or so and so whoever. He ultimately looks just like Moriarty, but like ultimately, like, yeah, just that's not him. And so recently everybody just believes him, and you have the inspector last trade who ultimately like, dude, we just got him on all these charges and everything like that, and you're just gonna let him go? And Holmes is like, yeah, but that's not the right guy. You didn't get the right guy. So pushing on, so we have it to where ultimately Holmes is trying to figure out who the actual murderer of this story is. Ultimately, we have Sherlock Holmes and Watson, who has a home assistant of sorts that ultimately is shagging and or like having some bedroom business with all these famous-ish like people like Mark Twain and Einstein and all kinds of other people. And so ultimately we find out that ultimately this girl is having her way with all these men in Watson's room. And ultimately he's like, hey, why are you taking all these men into into my room? Who is Watson saying this to her? Like like ultimately we have Holmes and Watson's assistant that's ultimately saying like, well, like, man, you should really throw that mattress out. Like, you know how many guys that have like wrecked in there and all kinds of stuff. So pushing on, so we eventually have bizarrely like both Sherlock Holmes and Watson at some point eating an onion. Like we consistently have it to where Sherlock has this thing about eating this onion, and he's just like into an onion, and I'm just like, oh my god, that looks awful as heck. But I'm sure what it really is like it looks like an onion, but it's actually just a pure apple instead. Because it's like, come on, I highly doubt that these people are actually eating onions. I can't believe it's actually a legitimate onion that people are going to have people eat. Unless ultimately Will Ferrell is bringing in like trick onions or whatever for people, and what have you. So, pushing on, we ultimately find out that ultimately we have to have Sherlock Holmes meet the Queen because there is some in dire importance. And so ultimately, we have Sherlock rushing to get to the Queen, and ultimately, the dire importance is that ultimately Sherlock Holmes is having a birthday party. And so we end up finding out that it seems that there is some big cake that is severely hard to cut into, and so on and so forth. And that ultimately bleeds much more into a case that is going on. So we ultimately have it to where Watson ultimately asks Sherlock, well, hey, like how long did you know you were gonna have a surprise party? And he's like, I've known it for 3 weeks or something like that. Like ultimately, he pretty much mentions that at some point, like 3 weeks ago or something like that, that Watson was had some kind of crumples on his clothes that ultimately revealed some kind of cake crumbs that ultimately he had been testing cakes, and ultimately he had a smell of some like certain kind of wine that ultimately would kind of deal with parties. And so ultimately, like Sherlock already knew for how long ago that ultimately this was otherwise tied to this and that. So we eventually have it pushing on in this movie. We gotta push on a lot into all of this. So we eventually have it to where there is a case involved. In this case, otherwise ties a Grace Hart, who ultimately is a seemingly doctor or physician of sorts. Where ultimately it seems that Watson and Hart are ultimately going to be very much romantically entwined, and ultimately to where the point to where they are both together checking out this body, and then bizarrely it seems like they end up having to put all this like lotion or some kind of weird like they end up like kind of like smearing all of this like weird stuff all over this body, which makes no sense whatsoever to be smearing this stuff all over this body. And they're like bizarrely touching this body in weird absurd ways, and then they're touching themselves, and it looks very very weird. But it's kind of in I guess a remembrance of almost a quasi like Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore like ghost maneuver of sorts. And so ultimately they're doing this like weird touching thing, and ultimately they're like, it's weird looking, but whatever they're putting over this body, it's just odd. So pushing on, so we ultimately have it seemingly where Sherlock Holmes is ultimately meeting a girl called Millicent, and ultimately he is giving her an onion, and she is just eating it viciously. And ultimately Sherlock Holmes is like, you know what, I'm getting a little turned on by how you just viciously like had eaten that onion. Ultimately we have it to where Sherlock Holmes is like consistently like fantasizing about this girl, like thinking about like them being married and having a ton of kids and have like a white picket fence kind of lifestyle and so on and so forth. But so pushing on. So we eventually push on to have it to where after this party and after the whole deaths and everything along those means and along those lines, you ultimately push on to seemingly have Watson like mentioning that Moriarty had just escaped to America, never to be heard of again. So that way Watson can finish this book. Uh, but it seems that we will keep seeing things here and there of Moriarty, some resemblances, but not very much really close Moriarty actually there. But it becomes a whodunit story nonetheless. So eventually we have it to where Sherlock and Watson have to figure out this case. So reasonably, it eventually pours into a number of kind of different scenarios. Uh, we ultimately have it to where seemingly Watson and Holmes have to be kind of dipped into this gym of sorts, this old fashioned like gym that is ultimately making kind of fun of like a normal gym, how a normal gym would look. And so ultimately they start asking questions, and ultimately that lends them into having to uh, have Sherlock Holmes and Watson fighting this muscular man named Braun, who's actually WWE star Braun Strowman. And I'm ultimately just like, oh, okay, so you have to have a big wrestler guy that's going to fight Sherlock Holmes and Watson, because really, when looking at it, I'm like, oh, okay, so um, this is just like the Robert Downey Jr. movie Sherlock Holmes, where you had the big, the big giant guy who ultimately was fighting Robert Downey Jr. and he like would grab a hammer and fling it at him, and that would do nothing. It's the same thing, and ultimately that big guy was actually a wrestler himself. So I was ultimately just looking at that guy. I'm like, oh, didn't he used to wrestle in WWE? Yeah, I guess so. So pushing on, so we have Braun, who ultimately is fighting Watson because Sherlock is in Watson's corner, and so bizarrely we have to like have this at first just be like, okay, well, Watson is gonna fight Braun, but ultimately then Sherlock is ultimately saying like, well, yeah, like all you guys that are here already in this gym, well, you're gonna now have to pay for this fight. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, "Oh, I have to pay for this fight now." Like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just shell out money for this fight, which you are already gonna see for free anyways. And so nobody's bidding on the fight. They're just having to just pay for this fight that they were already going to see for free. And because they're escalating weird, bizarre-ish, like boxing, I guess, and all kinds of other sports and making fun of them. So reasonably, we have it to where it seems that uh, Watson, of course, ends up getting like very frightened and or terrified of fighting Braun, and ultimately just like Braun kind of like quickly like out muscles Watson, and so you have it to where ultimately Sherlock comes in and he's like, well, I can figure out a way to beat him. We have it to where ultimately he like mentions that he's gonna toss his uh God, what is it called? His pipe. There we go. He's gonna toss his pipe in the air to distract Braun, and then ultimately he's gonna like start like hitting him in certain ways and this and that, to where ultimately it's going to finally take down Braun. He's gonna grab his beard and like do all kinds of things and pull him down, just like in the Robert Downey Jr. movie. So we have it to where ultimately we have uh Sherlock going, oh, okay, this is all going to work perfectly. And so Sherlock ends up throwing his pipe and bizarrely doesn't do exactly what the slow motion thing says that it's going to happen. And so ultimately he's like, ah, crap. So you have it to where Braun is ultimately going to tear apart Sherlock, but then eventually Watson comes in with a wooden steel chair and just starts cracking the back of Braun. So ultimately, we have Braun who falls over and gets hurt by by Watson with a wooden steel chair. So, um, really, that's the tail end of that. But evidently, we get tied into Moriarty consistently, and ultimately, we have it to where eventually they rip off the Moriarty guy's beard, and again he has to still confess that he isn't actually Moriarty. He's just a look-alike. So having them still trying to figure out who this murderer is, it gets to the point of them like basically accusing almost everybody. It gets to the point where eventually they are talking to the Queen, and ultimately, for some reason or another, the Queen ends up getting like almost seemingly dying at some point, and you have it to where they are trying to hide the body while the guards are kind of knocking at the door, like, "Hey, where's the Queen? Hey, like it's been a while since we heard anything in here." And so Sherlock and Watson are like, "Oh my God, we accidentally killed the Queen." And so reasonably, like they are stuffing her in some like hideaway place, and ultimately they're ultimately gonna they're ultimately mentioned that they need to like chop up the body to ultimately try to shove it into a toilet of sorts. And so we have it to where eventually we have Watson and Sherlock who are eventually like Watson is holding a saw, and so you ultimately have the guys who ultimately break in the Queen's guard, and ultimately the Queen ultimately wakes up right at the moment and just be like, "Yeah, I will do this or that and whatever and what have you," kind of finishing whatever she was going to say, and ultimately Watson ultimately like tosses the saw. I was like, "Oh, thank God she's alive." So pushing on, so we eventually get it to where within this movie, again, Watson is kind of accusing everybody to the point where he even like accuses Watson at some point, and because ultimately Watson desperately wants him and Holmes to be like co-detectives or like there's a whole thing about Watson being Sherlock's co-detective or co-worker or whatever, like a co like they are working together, and Sherlock is ultimately just like, well, no, like if anything, like I just like you as my protege and whatever. Like, funny enough, we have this whole entire scene where ultimately we have Sherlock talking to his brother, and it seems like Sherlock and his brother are both talking to one another with their minds through like mind transference of sorts, and to where ultimately they're talking to one another using their minds. So you have this whole conversation going on between Sherlock Holmes and his brother, and they're not saying a word, but ultimately like there's like this back and forth thing going on. It's hilarious. And we ultimately have Watson, who is desperately trying to talk through his mind as well, but everything is coming off like caveman-ish, like speak, like me doing this, me talk, and so we have it to where Sherlock is like, "Hey, stop that! You're confusing us." So ultimately, Watson has to be relegated to some like assistant or apprentice or assistant quarters of all these people that are all like dogs and pets and elephant men and whoever else and crazy people that are assistants, and Watson's desperately like trying to get out of the door of this place, but he gets locked in. So we ultimately have it to where pushing on more to eventually get more of this review done, because this movie is so weird. So we end up pushing more onto this movie, and really there is quasi quite a bit of filler in this movie, but like there's also some interesting moments. Like at some point they end up finding a concoction that seems to be a thing to poison people, and so eventually we have to Watson ends up taking the poison, and so we have it to where while Watson is mentioning like all the stuff that is going wrong with him. You have Sherlock going like, "Oh yeah, I guess that is another symptom," and "Oh yes, this is another symptom," it's like, and so on and so forth. While like Watson is basically dying, and like Sherlock is just like looking over him, like, "Yeah, I guess yeah, like that's what poison would probably do to you," and so you ultimately have it to her very much that. Sherlock finally eventually gives Watson the antidote, and ultimately it seems that there are some quasi side effects to where Sherlock doesn't even want to look at Watson for all the side effects. Like at some point, it seems that we have it to where ultimately like Sherlock is like repetitiously like vomiting and just like we just have it to where he's just consistently vomiting while people are talking. He's like blah! It's just like it's like blah! It's like blah! And it just goes on and on with this where Sherlock is like blah! It's like okay, sure, all right, this is the goofiest movie that I've ever seen. So pushing on. So we have it to where ultimately we have both Watson and Sherlock eventually going into this bar and they are heavily drinking. And so we have it to where we have we have Sherlock who has to confirm how exactly to pee, and he has to go through the whole notion of like, well, okay, like like the wind is coming off this way, and ultimately the best way for me to not be able to hit my shoes is to basically tip to this side and so on and so forth, and ultimately so Sherlock confirms how to pee off of the side of this of off of the side of this establishment, where ultimately Watson is ultimately just kind of peeing, and the pee is just going anywhere, and to ultimately I think it goes on his shoes at some point. But anyways, we ultimately have Sherlock is ultimately trying to figure out how is the best way to pee, and so he's ended up like oh, okay, I've confirmed this now, so now I can pee. And we ultimately have to where Sherlock hasn't taken his wang out of his pants yet, and so ultimately he's just peeing his pants, and so ultimately he's just like, oh crap, well, like I've already peed my pants, so what else could I do? So we push on. There's so much to push on about in this movie. It's a very goofy film, and like there's a lot of goofy things going on in it. So anyways, we have it to where eventually Sherlock eventually gets accused of or Watson ends up getting accused of being the villainous person, because ultimately Sherlock ultimately is accusing him of being the murderer, because ultimately Watson has been jealous and has been wanting to be co-detective for a very long time now, and that's ultimately the I guess the motive that he needs to figure this all out. And Watson's like, "How could you say that?" It's like I don't really care that much, but like I would never kill people to get that far. And so reason we have it to where it's like, well, hey, Watson's just kind of grabbing at straws right now, because ultimately like he can't figure out like every single thing is telling him to lead some way, but ultimately, uh, like like eventually he's gonna pivot eventually. So going on into this, we keep going through and going through this whole whodunit thing, and we have it to where eventually towards the very end of this movie, Sherlock eventually comes up with the consensus of who actually did all of this. And so we ultimately come to the consensus that the person who done it all was actually their assistant there the entire time. The girl that was bringing in men to just like uh, to go and shack up with all these men in Watson's room. Ultimately, bringing in like two men at one point to just kind of have their way with this girl. So that ultimately was the consensus of who done this, because ultimately they couldn't, I guess, figure out who actually did it. And reasonably that was like the end of it. Or ultimately it was like, okay, well, yeah, this person did it. Woohoo! Yeah, right. So reasonably, other than that, like it was a really bizarre film. It was kind of an odd movie. Like to me, I thought it was. There is some interesting points. I think it was a good, quasi good enough story, but I think there was a lot jumbled all over the place, where even like I was having issues, like going like, okay, now I have to review this movie. How am I going to do that? Because there's so much going on in this film. I think is the real true problem is there's so much going on that ultimately you'd have to rewatch it again and again to remember certain things, and ultimately I just can't take that kind of time for this movie, or why would I? But justifiably, yeah, I thought that this movie was fun, but other than that, I think I'm going to call this one a review. Um, Reasonably, I thought this movie was it was fun. That's all it needed to be. Anything more than that. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.